A well-known lawyer enters the courtroom, dressed sharply, carrying the confidence of someone who has won many cases. But there's something troubling about him: his reputation. He isn't just known for being aggressive in court. He is known for something worse. He has a history of making racist remarks, especially when defending his clients against black defendants. And today is no different. Across the room sits the defendant, a black man accused of a serious crime. He looks calm, but deep inside, he is nervous. He knows he didn't commit the crime, but that might not matter. He has seen how the system works, and with a lawyer like this arguing against him, the odds are not in his favor. Before the trial even begins, the lawyer smirks. He looks at the jury and confidently declares, "We all know he's guilty." His words echo through the courtroom, shocking some and confirming the fears of others. He hasn't even presented any evidence yet. But he believes he doesn't need to. In his mind, the case is already decided. The courtroom falls silent for a moment. The judge gives a warning, but the lawyer doesn't care. He has used this strategy before, and it has worked. He relies on bias, on fear, on assumptions. He believes the jury will follow his lead without thinking twice. But something is different this time. The jury doesn't react the way he expects. Instead of nodding along, some of them exchange glances. They seem uncomfortable. They seem unsure. The trial is just beginning, but one thing is clear: this case will not go as planned. This lawyer wasn't just any attorney. He had built his entire career on confidence, manipulation, and a sharp tongue. His reputation in the legal world was well known: aggressive, ruthless, and, most of all, biased. For years he had used prejudice as a weapon in the courtroom, often turning cases in his favor by playing on racial stereotypes. It wasn't the first time he had made such a bold claim in front of a jury. In fact, it was part of his strategy. He believed that if he spoke with enough certainty, people would believe him. He didn't care about evidence. He didn't need proof. All he needed was to plant a seed of doubt, a small thought that made the jury question the defendant just because of who he was. His history was filled with cases like this. There were multiple instances where his words alone swayed juries before the trial even truly began. He had a habit of painting black defendants as untrustworthy, dangerous, or guilty without ever proving it. And time again, it worked. Critics had spoken out against him before, but nothing ever changed. He was protected by his success. As long as he won cases, his behavior was overlooked. Judges gave him warnings, but no real consequences followed. Other lawyers despised him but feared going against him. He had power, and he knew it. To him, this case was just another easy victory. Another moment to showcase his influence. Another chance to prove that his words alone could decide a man's fate. He stood tall, ready to manipulate the courtroom once again. But what he didn't realize was that this time, his tactics wouldn't work as they had before. The jury was watching closely, and something in the air felt different. The defendant, Marcus Johnson, was a 32-year-old father of two who worked as a mechanic in his local community. Known for his honesty and dedication to his family, he had never been in trouble with the law before. That's why it was such a shock when he was accused of an armed robbery that took place miles from where he was at the time. On the night of the crime, Marcus was at a friend's house watching a basketball game. Several people could vouch for him, yet the police focused on him due to a vague witness description, one that simply mentioned a black man in a hoodie. That, combined with the racist lawyer's aggressive accusations, made it seem like Marcus was guilty before he even had a chance to defend himself. Despite his alibi, Marcus faced an uphill battle. The legal system had never been designed to work in his favor, and his public defender, while competent, had limited resources compared to the prosecution. From the moment he was arrested, Marcus felt the weight of a system that seemed more interested in convicting him than finding the truth. When he heard the lawyer confidently declare him guilty before any evidence was presented, Marcus knew the fight would be harder than he had imagined. He wasn't just battling a wrongful accusation. He was fighting deep-seated prejudice in the courtroom. His attorney struggled to get the jury to see past their own biases, knowing that cases like these often ended in convictions based on race rather than fact. As the trial began, Marcus sat silently, watching as his future was debated like a game. But he wasn't just going to accept his fate. He was determined to prove his innocence, no matter how much the lawyer tried to twist the truth. From the moment the trial started, the lawyer representing the prosecution, Richard Calloway, made his presence felt. Known for his brash demeanor and history of racially charged remarks, he wasted no time setting the tone. In his opening statement, he strode confidently across the courtroom, smirking as he pointed at Marcus. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are looking at a guilty man," Calloway declared, his voice booming through the silent room. "A man who was caught red-handed and now wants you to believe he was somewhere else." He ignored the fact that Marcus had a solid alibi and instead painted a picture of a criminal who fit the profile. As Calloway spoke, his argument relied less on facts and more on coded language meant to play on the jury's biases. He described Marcus as suspicious, untrustworthy, and someone who looked like he didn't belong. It was clear he was leaning on stereotypes rather than actual evidence, assuming that the jury would follow his lead without question. But something was off. Instead of nodding along, some jurors exchanged glances. A few furrowed their brows. Calloway was too comfortable, too arrogant, and it was starting to show. When the prosecution presented its case, it quickly became evident that it was built on flimsy ground. The only eyewitness was an elderly woman who admitted she saw the suspect from a distance and wasn't entirely sure of her identification. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no surveillance footage linking Marcus to the crime. Yet, Calloway pressed on, acting as if his confidence alone was enough to convict. Marcus's defense attorney, Rachel Porter, faced an uphill battle. She knew that facts alone wouldn't be enough. She had to fight against the unspoken prejudices hanging over the case. She questioned the reliability of the witness, highlighted the lack of physical evidence, and brought attention to Marcus's strong alibi. But every time she spoke, Calloway interrupted, throwing in snide remarks and dismissive gestures, trying to undermine her credibility. "Come on, counselor," he scoffed at one point. "We all know what's really going on here." The judge remained passive, allowing Calloway's tactics to continue unchecked. But Marcus remained calm, knowing that losing his temper would only feed into the lawyer's strategy. Instead, he focused on the facts and trusted that the truth would find a way through. As the trial continued, the tension in the room grew thicker. The jury listened, but there was an undeniable battle happening before their eyes, a fight between a biased system and a man who refused to be crushed by it. What Calloway didn't realize, however, was that his arrogance was starting to work against him. The more he ignored the facts, the more the jury began to see the cracks in his argument. And that was when everything started to change. As the prosecution wrapped up its case, something unusual began to happen. The jury wasn't reacting the way Richard Calloway expected. Normally, in cases where race and prejudice were quietly at play, jurors would nod along, absorbing the prosecution's narrative without question. But this time, doubt was creeping in. Some jurors exchanged glances when Calloway confidently restated that Marcus had been at the scene without a single piece of physical evidence to prove it. A woman in the front row shifted uncomfortably when he exaggerated the witness's certainty, even though the woman herself had admitted she wasn't sure. A man in the back leaned forward, furrowing his brow when Calloway mocked Marcus's alibi. Calloway, drunk on his own overconfidence, didn't notice. He was so sure of himself, so convinced that the jury would follow his lead, that he failed to see how his own words were undermining his case. He repeated the same racist tropes too many times, relied too much on assumption, and failed to provide anything solid. Meanwhile, the jury couldn't ignore what was missing. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no security footage. The eyewitness testimony was weak at best, and when cross-examined by the defense, the witness admitted she was pressured by detectives to confirm Marcus as the suspect. Slowly, the jury's expressions changed from neutral to skeptical. The confident narrative Calloway had pushed was unraveling before their eyes. One particularly damning moment came when Calloway became visibly irritated by the jury's lack of immediate agreement. In a moment of frustration, he dismissed the need for strong evidence altogether. "Come on, folks," he said with a chuckle. "We don't need all that technical stuff to see the truth." That was the moment everything shifted. The words hung in the air, and the jurors' expressions hardened. They weren't just being asked to convict a man. They were being told to ignore their own reasoning, to convict based on nothing more than Calloway's confidence. It was an insult to their intelligence, and it did not sit well. For the first time in the trial, Calloway looked uncertain. He noticed the shift, the way the jury no longer seemed eager to believe him. He tried to backtrack, tried to regain control, but it was too late. The jury had started to see the truth. The case wasn't about justice. It was about assumption, and they weren't sure they wanted to be a part of it. As the defense prepared to present its counter-arguments, a new energy filled the courtroom. Marcus wasn't just a defendant anymore. He was a man being railroaded by a system that expected the jury to go along with it. And for the first time, the jury wasn't so sure they would. Sensing the shift in the jury's attitude, Marcus's defense attorney, Rachel Porter, knew it was time to strike, while the cracks in the prosecution's case were still fresh. She stood confidently and began dismantling Calloway's weak argument piece by piece. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but firm, "you have just heard the prosecution ask you to convict a man, not based on evidence, but on assumption." She walked over to the jury box, locking eyes with several jurors. "But let's talk about the facts." One by one, she laid them out. Marcus had a rock-solid alibi. He was with multiple witnesses at the time of the crime, people with no reason to lie for him. The so-called eyewitness had admitted on the stand that she wasn't certain and had been pressured by law enforcement. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance footage, nothing placing Marcus at the scene. Then came the most damning part. Rachel presented key evidence that the prosecution had conveniently ignored. A security camera near the crime scene had captured a blurry figure running away, but the build and clothing didn't match Marcus at all. The police had this footage, but they chose not to pursue it further. "Why?" Rachel asked, pausing for effect, because they thought they already had their suspect. She turned back to the jury. "And why did they think that? Because of the color of his skin?" A tense silence filled the courtroom. Even Calloway shifted in his seat, realizing he had lost control of the narrative. Then came the final blow. Rachel called Marcus to the stand. He spoke calmly and honestly about his alibi, his fear when he was arrested, and his frustration at being accused of a crime he didn't commit. His sincerity was undeniable. By the time Rachel delivered her closing argument, the shift in the room was clear. The jury no longer looked like they were debating guilt. They looked like they were questioning how this case even made it to trial in the first place. The prosecution had underestimated the jury's ability to think critically. And now, the decision was no longer as simple as Calloway had assumed. The truth was out, and the jury had to decide whether they would follow the prosecution's blind certainty or the undeniable facts in front of them. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in after hours of deliberation. Marcus sat still, his hands clasped tightly together, his heart pounding in his chest. Calloway, still smug despite the shift in the trial, leaned back in his chair, convinced the system would work in his favor like it always had. The judge asked the jury for their decision. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, stood and cleared her throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant." A pause. A breath. "Not guilty." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A stunned Calloway sat up straight, his face turning red. He had been so certain, so sure that the jury would blindly follow his lead. Now, he looked like a man who had just realized his arrogance had cost him everything. Marcus exhaled sharply, almost unable to process the words. Not guilty. He was free. His attorney, Rachel, squeezed his shoulder in reassurance as he blinked back tears of relief. In the audience, murmurs of shock and approval spread. Some couldn't believe the jury had gone against the prosecution's expectations. Others felt vindicated. Justice had finally prevailed against a system that so often failed black men like Marcus. Calloway stood abruptly, shaking his head in disbelief. He tried to mask his frustration, but the truth was evident. His usual tactics had failed. This time, the jury had seen through the prejudice, through the empty accusations. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom, a free man, he knew this wasn't just a personal victory. It was proof that sometimes the truth could still win, even in a system designed to ignore it.